A couple of quick comments at the outset on radio itself. I think radio remains a very important medium, but it's greatly overlooked in media studies. There's a real dearth of research taking place today on radio. And in China, where I work, it's almost never mentioned. I don't think I've ever seen radio mentioned in an undergraduate essay to date in 1.5 years, despite the fact that radio in China has a reach of about 98% of the population, while the internet is only 42.1%. So there's a real contrast between those two mediums, and yet radio is almost never mentioned. Okay, so my presentation today then looks at the place of radio in the Northern Ireland broadcasting environment and suggests that it's considerably different to that of the rest of the UK. And I'll show the different ways where this is the case, but it's especially true in regards to radio as a source of local and nations news. And today I want to suggest that BBC Radio plays a more significant role in the public sphere than BBC Network Radio as compared to the other nations, for example Scotland and Wales. And I'll present 4 concluding arguments by way of theorisation, but I'll contend that further empirical research is required if we're to fully understand the role of radio in Northern Ireland and the place that it plays. But at the outset, I want to go to a quotation from Mark Lawson, the presenter of the art show on BBC Radio 4. And Lawson says, front row, and Lawson says, at various times in its history, it has been a piece of luck for the BBC to be generally known by its initials, rather than the full trading name, the British Broadcasting Corporation. So obviously, Northern Ireland remaining constitutionally a place as part of the United Kingdom, but over many decades and indeed many centuries, being a divided society in terms of that constitutional question. But Lawson says that it's been a piece of luck for the BBC. And he goes on to suggest, quotes, a current problem, for example, is what it means to be an officially British broadcaster in an era of increased independence for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think here that Lawson is right in terms of Scotland and the impending referendum on independence. But I want to suggest today that in Northern Ireland, BBC Radio faces no similar crisis. Instead, the broadcaster in the province can lay claim to solid support among the audience and faces no such impending crisis. And indeed, in relation to BBC Radio Ulster, that I'll come on to explain more fully in a while, the focus of this study, the BBC has been successful at establishing a broadcaster that appeals equally to the Catholic nationalist section of the public as to the Protestant unionist, and continues to play a central role in the political, cultural, social and economic life of Northern Ireland. Okay, so firstly to then outline some socio-political factors in Northern Ireland society. And following the Belfast Agreement, sometimes called the Good Friday Agreement, signed in May 1998, Northern Ireland has experienced relative peace and political stability, although there are many remaining divisions. So here peace is relative. There have been a number of killings of police officers and soldiers, particularly in 2009 and also in 2011, and the threat from dissident Republicans remains high. So peace is relative, and also political stability is relative. And the protests against the removal of the Union Jack flag at Belfast City Hall in December 2012 show considerable disenfranchisement among Protestants in deprived urban areas. Now, one of the changes that's been noticeable here is the identification of one's national identity as Northern Irish as something which is on the rise. Previously identified as British or Irish were the two overwhelming categories. But in the 2011 census, 20.94% recorded Northern Irish only as their national identity. By contrast, British only, 38%, and Irish only, 25%. Now, most social researchers here are comparing those figures to another part of that census, which is the religion that one is brought up in. And there we can see that the religion one is brought up in, Protestant 45%, Catholic 48%. So it is inferred that there's been a big shift, especially among young Northern Irish Catholics, from calling themselves Irish to calling themselves Northern Irish. And I want to argue today that that's partly to do with the continued success of Radio Ulster in Northern Ireland. Lowe and Muldoon here have suggested that the establishment of power sharing arrangements at Stormont, that's where the Belfast Assembly is based, especially from the St Andrews Agreement onwards, has led to a degree of structural support to this fledgling identity. In other words, they see a link between political stability in a power sharing arrangement in Belfast with this growing sense of being Northern Irish rather than British or Irish separately. In terms of broadcasting then, how can Northern Ireland compare to the rest of the UK? Some statistics from Ofcom. Well, Northern Ireland has the highest proportion of households with pay TV at 63%. The UK average is 58%. In the early evening television news bulletins, UTV, that's the former Ulster Television, now a major UK player with its ownership of Talksport. It has more viewers than BBC Northern Ireland's Newsline. TV is the main source of local news, with 60% of the population stating this. The UK average is 53%. And my focus today is on radio. Radio consumption in terms of listening hours per day remains at 3.2 hours, and that's the same as the UK average. But I want to then suggest that there are significant differences in the place of radio, again staying with some Ofcom work, which is a sort of leading work in this area. And firstly, DAB, that's digital radio, take-up in Northern Ireland is the lowest in the UK, only 22%. And thus, naturally, analogue listening share at 76% is the highest in the UK. So people in Northern Ireland have been very slow and quite reluctant to move to digital radio. Northern Ireland is the only nation of the UK where more people work in radio than in television. And indeed, also, if you break it down by region, there's only, I think, one or two other regions in the whole of the UK where this is the case. Two of the things I want to focus on now is also drawn from the Ofcom research in this area. And this is where Ofcom asked people, what is your main source of both local news and then nations news? So nations news is news about Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland, news about Scotland in Scotland, etc. And from this data we see that the Northern Ireland population considers radio as a significantly more important source of local news than the UK average. And the Northern Ireland population considers radio as a significantly more important source of nations news than the populations of Wales and Scotland. So I'll now show two graphs which are drawn from the Communications Market Report of 2012 published by Ofcom. Okay, so we see UK, England, Scotland, Wales then broken down alongside Northern Ireland. And on the right-hand column on the screen, if you look at the green colour, green stands for radio in this case. And as a source of local news, news about your local area, you can see that at 22%, following TV, which is the most significant for all of the regions, nations, and the UK as a whole, that radio plays a significantly more important role within Northern Ireland. The closest to that is England at 10%. Incidentally, these figures are consistent with previous communications market reports, so the 2011 figures are very similar. And so there's no anomaly in the 2012 figures. So that's radio as a source of local news. What about radio as a source of nations news? Now, unfortunately, here the colour changes. This time it changes to pink. Again, news about Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland. Television is again the sort of leading source of nations news. But again, radio is a much more significant source of nations news than Scotland and Wales. In Scotland, only 5%. In Wales, only 8%. There's a standout jump there, up to 21% in Northern Ireland. Now, how do we understand these figures? One person who's tried to do that is Paul Moore. And Paul Moore, writing in 2003, says that, quotes, "It is radio rather than television that has the central role in the public's media consciousness," thinking here about Northern Ireland. He suggests there's a suspicion of television especially among nationalists, as it is perceived to be produced outside of Northern Ireland. Although I would suggest this is a rather unclear point that Moore makes, because there is a lot of local BBC television produced and also local television produced by UTV. He says radio, on the contrary, appears to be produced locally for a local audience by local people. And Moore goes on to argue that Northern Ireland is based on oral tradition, which radio suits. And I like Moore's article, but I think that his contentions alone do not necessarily explain public service radio's place in Northern Ireland. And again, we can think here, what about Scotland and Wales? That said, regarding the Ofcom figures on local and nations news versus newspapers, Moore may have a point. You may have noticed in those graphs that newspapers play a very insignificant role in Northern Ireland, so his point on oral culture may have some validity. BBC Radio 2 reached 27.5% of the population across the UK, but in Northern Ireland only 12%. So people are listening a lot in Northern Ireland to Radio Ulster. And my final graph that I want to show today again bears this out, and this is on the weekly reach of BBC, Radio Ulster and Foyle, sitting at 38%. We see comparatively Scotland, Radio Scotland and its Gaelic station only reaching 23%. And when you combine Radio in Wales and Radio Cymru, 24%. So again, radio remains very significant within the public sphere in Northern Ireland. So, radio listening to the BBC in Northern Ireland, what are they listening to? Well, primarily they're listening to BBC Radio Ulster. So that's the main station, broadcast from Belfast, and acting as a nation's radio broadcaster. So it has the status of, for example, BBC Radio Scotland. It has a smaller partner called BBC Radio Foyle. That's broadcast from Derry in Northern Ireland, and it is an 8 hours a week opt-out. So it has some local content. But for the purposes of this paper, it's Radio Ulster, which we're thinking of. And just a point of fact, in case you're unclear, the word Ulster refers to one of the provinces of Ireland, which maps mostly, but also has 3 other counties which are in the Republic of Ireland. But Ulster and Northern Ireland are largely interchangeable words. So for example, the professional rugby team in Northern Ireland is Ulster Rugby. Okay, so Radio Ulster producing 9,740 hours of output in 2010-2011, and roughly 1/4 of this output was news, weather and sport. Some 50% of the audience is made up of people aged 55 and over. And like all of BBC Radio right now, it is required to make delivering quality first. That's DQF savings of 15% by 2016. In terms of its minority language programming, BBC Radio Ulster is required in its service licence to broadcast at least 220 hours of Indigenous minority language programming, including Irish language and Ulster Scots output each year. Ulster Scots is a slightly tenuous language. I need to be careful as I'm being recorded in terms of what I say. Slightly tenuous language based upon the Scottish heritage in Ulster. The main programme there is Kista Words, and that began in 2002. In terms of Irish language programming is much more significant. So Blast is broadcast every weekday in the 1903 slot. And indeed, the priority here of Irish language programming, that comes from the Good Friday Agreement, where Irish language programming was prioritised. In terms of other key public service broadcasting strands or streams, I think the 2 main programmes we can look at are these. This is the Nolan Show and Talkback. Now the Nolan Show, Stephen Nolan is quite well known because he also is on BBC Radio 5 Live, broadcasting nationally at the weekend, but on the weekdays he's in Northern Ireland broadcasting to the population in Northern Ireland. The Nolan Show has the highest radio audience of any Northern Irish programme, that's across all stations, and it's a phone-in debate also with key political interviews. Now here, Nolan's broadcasting style is quite interventionist, and I want to sort of tentatively suggest that at times he strays from what might be considered the sort of standard tone of BBC broadcasting. On the way to the airport yesterday, I listened to Nolan, and yes, at times he is quite assertive in a way that other BBC presenters may not be. Talkback has been broadcasting for over 20 years, and the producers say for many years it was a sounding board for the public to react and comment on the sectarian violence of the Troubles and the development of the peace process. Now, I'm cutting here for time, so I want to jump to this, and this is an article by Stephen Coleman. And Coleman, writing in Yavnos, the Public, wrote an article on the aforementioned Talkback. And he notes in the 1990s, a degree of peace has been formed in Northern Ireland, but the community building needs to be sustained from bottom-up discussion. He says, quotes, "It's for this reason that talk radio, in the context of a deeply divided society, of segregated communities and hostile publics, largely devoid of a shared identity of nationhood, is of more than usual significance. If by talking on the radio, publics can speak on the publics, whom they would ignore if they lived in the next street, then phone-in programming could be regarded as the basis of an authentic public sphere." And his reference there to ignoring people in the next street, it's not just a sort of a symbolic reference, it's a literal reference, because Belfast remains to this day divided by peace walls. In fact, there's more peace walls today than there was when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. So Coleman is bang on that point. And following on the subject of Talkback, he notes that in 1998 it had a larger audience reach than any other European phone-in programme. And he comes to this fairly astonishing statistic. In the week before the 1997 Drum Creek Parade, that was an Orange Order march, 21,000 people phoned into Talkback, equating to 1.3% of the Northern Irish population. Phoning one programme in 1 week, 1.3%. It's the equivalent of about 689,000 people in England calling one radio programme in 1 week. A highly, highly unlikely scenario. Okay, I want to come now to 4 concluding arguments, and I would suggest that this is still a work in progress. So I haven't fully worked out all of the implications of these themes we see in the Ofcom research, but I will make 4 points. Firstly, PSB radio remains important and successful despite ongoing division in Northern Ireland. And I think here Radio Ulster could be considered an ideal type example of successful public service broadcasting in a divided society. In its service licence, it states that it should provide accurate, impartial and independent news services and play a central role in reporting, explaining and scrutinising political and social issues in Northern Ireland, as well as providing platforms where different subjects can be debated by listeners and expert commentators. And I think I want to suggest today that it does that, and it's doing that successfully, and that's borne out in the audience research. In Northern Ireland, at Stormont, there's an unlikely political alliance held together under the Hunt system. And I want to suggest that in Radio Ulster is able to also hold that audience together in a somewhat unlikely alliance. Secondly, the growing Northern Irish identity, identifying oneself as Northern Irish rather than British or Irish, may explain this success in part. With Northern Ireland produced public service broadcasting radio that focuses on Northern Irish issues, matching the apparent cultural importance of radio in Northern Ireland. So, to go back to the Lawson quote at the beginning, it would seem that the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Britishness, is no stumbling block to the Catholic nationalist community, and rather Radio Ulster has been able to transcend that division and produce radio which is accessible to all. Thirdly, and I know I'm out of time, thirdly, further empirical research is required. And I want to suggest here that a detailed social study should be undertaken that specifically addresses issues regarding public service broadcasting in a divided society with a focus on radio. So this could be something led by the BBC, Ofcom, the BBC Trust, Department for Culture, Arts and Leisure in Northern Ireland, possibly even DCMS at the national level. And its findings could be important for policy formation in other similar settings. If Radio Ulster is the success story that it appears to be, then it would be good for other divided parts of the world that have public service broadcasters to be able to understand how they make that work. But fourthly, additional theoretical work, and that's what I'm trying to do here, that accompanies empirical audience research is also required. There was a Kantar Media BBC Trust survey that I didn't have time to mention. That is an incredibly rich data set. The report on that runs to about 100 pages, but it's just data. There's no analysis, there's no theoretical work trying to explain the role of radio in Northern Irish society. And I think media studies researchers and media policy researchers need to keep going to these Ofcom reports to try and bring further understanding to the place of radio in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you.
So as part of today's theme on public sector broadcasters, public service broadcasters, I'm going to present some elements of my research. It's multidisciplinary, it covers conflict, media, French studies and Russian studies, and it provides a comparative analysis of the state of European foreign conflict reporting by public sector broadcasters in the post-9/11 and post-Cold War era. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the three broadcasters I'm going to, that I look at. I'll give you an overview of my quantitative research, and then I'll illustrate some of my qualitative research using a particular case study. So, who am I analysing? I've got the BBC News at 10, a British public service broadcaster, Russia's Vremya, a national state-aligned broadcaster, and France's 20 from a media system with a long history of state intervention. So they're all comparable, they're all PSBs or state news providers, rather than being commercial or independent broadcasters. These are the logos they use, and I'll be using them in subsequent slides so that you know who I'm talking about. They've got various points in common. All three represent major channels with recognised news programmes within their own country's media systems, all subject to news management by the political executive. There are differences in their finances. The BBC uses the licence fee, France has advertising income and a licence fee, and Channel 1, which is Vremya, the Russian one, receives its income from advertising and from investment from state-aligned or state-owned companies. As regards state intervention, BBC has little state intervention, France has a bit more, and Vremya has lots. It's state-controlled, even to the extent there are weekly meetings with the Kremlin to determine the contents of the news schedule. And all three are aware that their news possesses specific emphasis, which might require either distributing or defending, and this is apparent through their desire to broadcast this digitally to the overseas market through BBC World News, RT and France 24. So, the area I use as my thesis case study is the Middle East, and I define this to be Israel, Palestinian territories and Lebanon, and the period I'm looking at is the mid-2006 to mid-2008. Firstly, because this is an ongoing conflict, it has various flashpoints, and it also includes everyday life. It also includes the political and diplomatic involvement of the international communities. And also, the three reporting countries have similar links to the region. Internationally, all three have imperial links to the area and appear to be striving to create a new post-imperial diplomatic role for themselves. The overarching aim of my research is to examine the national characteristics of these three PSBs, looking at aspects such as state-channel relations, whether or not the channels focus on the human element of war, do they view foreign conflict reporting through the prism of the war on terror, and also do domestic concerns influence the reporting. I'm using news values as an agenda setting as my methodology to determine why news providers find certain images and stories particularly newsworthy, why they are higher in the running order, and why they shape a certain why there's such a representation of an event. So these are the values. For example, you've got negativity, bad news sells, there's threshold. That's interesting because this differs from country to country. The there's more graphic images in France and Russia than there are in the UK. However, that seems to be changing. I don't know if you've seen that in the Syria reports recently. There's been some very lurid images of victims, especially when they were talking about the chemical weapons. Those were quite gruesome for what the target audience is used to. There's also things like personalisation. Stories including real people, famous leaders of countries are newsworthy, and there's finally how a story fits into the existing schedule. So I'll start with a bit on my quantitative analysis. I started off with a general quantitative overview of the information I gathered to illustrate how the broadcasters provide several versions or representations of a single conflict. I catalogued the programmes, categorised them into international, foreign and Middle East stories. I calculated the airtimes for each of these and their running orders, and finally classed them into human conflict, human interest, religion, political and peace attempts, and domestically related stories. I also found that there's a strong imperial link to the reporting, and you can see this on these comparative maps. They're just still in their infancy, so they're all a bit wonky in some places. These show the international reporting of the three broadcasters, not the domestic reporting. The news providers prefer to focus on certain areas of the world. So France had more news items from Africa, but also from Europe. Russia had a concentration of items from the former Soviet Union countries and East European countries, and a large number of the UK's foreign reports are from the Gulf, reflecting the UK's military involvement there. All three focus on the US, but Vremya reports most on the US out of the three. I also determined a difference in the airtime given to the foreign conflict reporting and the Middle East reporting by the three broadcasters. These maps, they do all use the same scale, indicate that the highest value attached to the foreign conflict reporting is by News at 10 in the top right, and the least is by Vanter from France. The huge graph for Vremya is because of the extended coverage of the war in Georgia. They elongated the coverage of the war in Georgia. If it were the same size as all the others, most of the graph would be a straight line. So this order alters slightly for Middle East related reporting, where the least airspace is provided by Vremya. Also, not only does the News at 10 have the highest airtime for Middle East reporting, but given that its total airtime is the shortest, this means that proportionately it dedicates more of its programme to this subject than the other two broadcasters. I then looked at the subject matters discussed by the broadcasters with their Middle East items and classed them as I've already stated. And yes, there are 4 circles for 3 broadcasters. However, this is because it became apparent that the News at 10 adopts a reporting strategy where the majority of the Middle East related news comprised a main story, which would introduce the news item and gain its position in the running order because of a particular news value. This would then be used to bring in a secondary news item, which was not necessarily directly related to the first one that they started with. For example, one introduction suggests that the report will centre on attempts by Israeli forces in Gaza to capture Palestinian militants, and that raised the conflict value of the piece, while in fact the remainder of the item then goes on to talk about the effects of life in Gaza and being isolated from the rest of the world. Therefore, the News at 10 stories were categorised twice into main and secondary items, so that's why you've got those 2 circles there. This reveals a shift in emphasis from domestic-related new items in the main news to human interest items, a theme which prevails on the News at 10 and concurs not only with the overarching futility of war theme, but also the support our troops narrative, which permeates the BBC schedule. This approach wasn't necessary with the other 2 broadcasters. On Vanter, which is in Vanter, which is in the bottom here, over a third of Vanter's reports are conflict-based, with almost equal shares being human interest and political peace attempts. Vanter deviates from concentrating on conflict reporting when covering the Middle East by broadcasting many wide-ranging human interest and religion stories, illustrating a less restricted interpretation of the Middle East than that of the News at 10. It also provides reports from this region, which are foreign reporting rather than just foreign conflict reporting. For example, its ongoing narrative concerning the departure of young French Jews for life in Israel and their subsequent life there. It also endeavours to raise France's own diplomatic status by focusing on political and peace attempts. And particular importance is also attached to news stories with any links to France, its leaders or its citizens. The selection of items on Vremia indicates an important distinction between the three channels. Because the channel is state-owned or state-aligned, rather than being a public sector broadcaster, the perceived newsworthiness of stories on Vremia is largely determined by the imposing of state-related news items on the news schedule. Thus, the emphasis placed by Vremia on domestically related items here is particularly high and is actually greater than for conflict items. Similarly, many of the political or peace attempt items appear to gain value either because of Russia's involvement in a news item. For example, there's always heightened importance to the role of the quartet, which Russia is attached to. Vremia attaches particular significance to the positive role of Russian leaders, Russian services and institutions in the Middle East, which not only reflects Putin's desire to raise Russia's global diplomatic status, but also characterises the news provision of Vremia. So, as a summary of the statistical analysis, we can see that News at 10 attached most important of the three to both foreign conflict reporting and Middle East reporting. It prioritised coverage from within the Palestinian territories and emphasised conflict coverage and humanitarian issues to the exclusion of most general interest stories. Vanta provided broader coverage, providing information about Lebanon, everyday life in Israel and religious events. Particular priority is given to news stories with links to France and its leaders or citizens. Vremia provided an even broader scope in its reporting by including many non-conflict related stories, particularly covering Israel. Again, the Middle East is not just a site of conflict, and Vremia uses the conflict narrative to emphasise the close connections between Russia and the Russian-speaking diaspora in Israel and the role of Russians and the Russian leaders. So it's against this background of differing geopolitical approaches, differing airtime allocations and differing diversities of subject matters within the Middle East coverage that we can hone in on the qualitative analysis. So I'll talk now about one particular case study, which was in Beit Hanun, and this occurred in the first week of November 2006. And this is a densely populated town located in the north of Gaza on the Israeli border where the Israeli Defence Forces were stationed. The town was subject to a six-day incursion by the IDF. These actions have been initiated to stop Qassam rocket launching activity by the Palestinians from Beit Hanun into neighbouring Israeli towns. This is increased military action resulted in the death of about 80 Palestinians and about 250 were injured. So I'll deal with one broadcaster and then the next. So during News at 10's coverage of these events, there were blurred representations of both the Israelis and Palestinians. The negativity value of filming conflict in action dominated over many of the other news values, and a particularly strong influence on the coverage is provided by the BBC correspondent Matthew Price, who provides highly personalised reports as he emphasises the status of the individual in conflict zones and raises the human interest value. Little context is provided in the Middle East reports, a criticism which has often been levied at the BBC, and as a result the conflict appears to be universalised. On one hand, this supports the UK government shift in stance from promoting invasion and occupation during the Iraq War to a softer approach. Yet on the other, it allows the broadcaster to highlight a prevailing undertone concerning the futility of war, which potentially opposes state policy as the latter sends more troops abroad. So this illustrates the independence of the News at 10 as part of the BBC, a public service broadcaster. So we see how the visuals are important here. We've got Price becomes an integral part of the scene as he interviews the mother of injured 9-year-old Saad. He's crouching beside the boy's bed, talking directly to the mother. Other women are present, peeking through the windows, and shots of the distress on his face when interviewing, and he's an outsider, but the shots of distress on his face when he's interviewing the bereaved father of a 6-month-old baby, heighten this same concept of the futility of war, which permeates the BBC's news reports, removing any context from this conflict and grouping it with all other conflicts throughout the world. The events are not purely portrayed from one or other point of view of the parties, but the personal and emotional reactions to these victims of the correspondent also emerge, and these transcend any cultural and religious attitudes which may be perceived through the remainder of the reports. So Price manages to portray, he ensures that the victims are at the heart of the reporting, leaving little doubt on one hand that the Israelis are the aggressors, whilst on the other he does contribute to complex representation of the Palestinians, with a demarcation between portrayals of the militant authorities and radicals on one hand, and representations of individuals portrayed as victims on the other. So if we move on to Van Ter's portrayal of these events, their portrayal appears to be totally different. They're indifferent to the suffering of individuals, and the correspondent plays a minimum role, appearing only once in person. Provision of context, however, is significant and is aimed, according to the Charter, at preventing any partial representation of the facts. Some of the contextual information is helpful. It's about where is the location of Beit Hanun, the size of its population. However, this is infrequent, and it's the remainder of the context which is interesting, because it only serves to comply superficially with the Charter, and instead its specific purpose from the outset is to portray the Palestinians in a radical manner as radical terrorists. So we have alternating images. For example, there's several images of Palestinian men crammed into trucks being driven away. But however uncomfortable these images may seem for viewers, evoking scenes from previous global wars, they're immediately followed by images of rockets being launched. These are shown in a stereotypical Palestinian militant video with the statement, 300 rockets of this type have been fired from Beit Hanun over past months, justifying the Israelis' need not only to interrogate the Palestinians, but keep the town under siege. There's a prevailing trend in Van Ter's coverage to minimise the Israelis' actions, while simultaneously associating all Palestinian activities with terrorism. This emphasis on them being terrorists rather than victims is evident in the contextual information and the use of several clips over the course of the items. This is contextual information which has been provided to or gathered by Van Ter independently of these actual events, so in other events. Yet they're used here in such a way that it cannot but influence the interpretation of the portrayals on the attacks of the town. So, moving on to Vremya. Vremya provides a more dramatic representation of the events. So, caught on one hand between the fear of Islamist radicalism at home and the need to maintain relations with the Arab world on the other, Russia is obliged to tread a fine line between exacerbating its internal security problems and offending its allies. In its capacity as national state broadcaster, Vremya adopts such an approach, conveying Russia's anti-terrorist preoccupation in its reports. Vremya's reporting country has no national interest here, so therefore these events must be framed to serve a purpose, which, in this case, highlights the role of terrorism. The events in Beit Hanun provide an ideal opportunity for Vremya to pursue this, despite the fact that the Palestinians are the victims here rather than the aggressors. Vremya seizes on the withdrawal of Israel, which he disparages at every opportunity as US allies, to report from a training camp for Palestinian militants. The reason for this report is explained by the alleged fear that Israelis could return at any minute, casting doubts again on the reliability and trustworthiness of Israeli actions. So this report produces shocking images broadcast because of their indisputable negativity and threshold values, which are evident in both the verbal and visual text. The reporter does not appear in person, but provides voiceovers to accompany the dramatic images of training in progress. Although militant vocabulary punctuated by orders issued at trainees and frequent rounds of gunfire does prevail throughout the verbal text, the general commentary is not as powerful as the visual images. There's little need to explain these visuals, and the reporters even underestimate some of them, with the accompanying phrase, conditions must be as close to reality as possible, but these do not really convey the horror of the images. I've got an image here of this. That will work. Is that one? Yes, it is. There's little doubt that these armed, camouflage-clad and hooded individuals are to be understood as terrorists. Yet, although this clear image of terrorists emerges, there's no accompanying context to explain the necessity for such training. Vrania thus universalises its portrayal of terrorism, just as Music 10 does with its portrayal of victims and the futility of war. And the trainees are portrayed as fledgling terrorists receiving a form of specific military training, the likes of which will be replicated throughout the world. So it's in analysing these three public service and state news providers, varying manners of mapping the world, we found out how their mapping of the world comes out. Within the war on terror, Israel is considered by all three news providers to differing degrees to be part of the West, and Palestine as a whole represents the other. However, it's not as simple as this sweeping suggestion might suggest. It's not just a case of us versus them. In fact, the analysis of the news providers' representations has revealed a complex interaction of the reporting countries. Possibly contrary to expectations, Vrania and Music 10 are similar. For example, both portray their nations as wanting to distance themselves from America, albeit for different reasons. Russia wants to further its own independent status in the post-Soviet era, and the UK, via Music 10, no longer wants to be viewed as the US's poodle, a phrase which is actually used quite frequently during the comparison period by not only the correspondents but also people that they interview during the programmes. And France is striving to reinforce its own diplomatic role within Europe, especially under Sarkozy, and appears indifferent to the US. So, to conclude, we can conclude very briefly by returning to the title of this. Informing, educating or manipulating, or should it be entertained, taken from the BBC's Charter mission, and which to a degree is applicable in spirit to the others. We've seen that although all three are public service or state-aligned broadcasters, the output of their work, their reports, differ significantly, and no one representation of the conflict is the same. The three broadcasters do indeed inform, educate and possibly entertain through the newsworthiness of their items, but only, and what is to be expected, within the context of their own reporting nations, reporting countries, national characteristics and values, which in certain cases does lead to a manipulation of the events. Thank you.